Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, a nonpartisan 501c3. This afternoon is an installment of our mainline series featuring the headmaster of the Haverford School, who's also a senior fellow at FPRI, John Nagl. So we say thank you to the Haverford School for hosting us. I'd also like to say thank you to our series co-chairs, who are James Gately, John Piasecki, and Eileen Rosenau. Thank you very much for hosting us. This afternoon, we're featuring Dr. Ellis, who's going to be talking about U.S. policy in Latin America, a topic, Latin America that is, that I think we at FPRI would like to do more of, because to me, it just seems very important, and it's our hemisphere. So before we get started, again, most of you know this, but I'll repeat it for those who don't. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box. The chat is reserved for technical issues. We'll also be putting some maps in there for those of you who would like to refresh your memories of what Latin America looks like on the map. And the chats also, if you have technical issues, please put them in there, but your questions, and we'll go about halfway through the program, we'll go to Q&A. We'll also be videotaping this. So if you want to watch it again or share it with your friends, you can do that. Let me say a few words about John Nagl, who, as I mentioned, is the 9th headmaster of the Haverford School. He was the president of the Center for a New American Security in Washington, D.C., and remains a non-resident senior fellow there. He spent 20 years in the U.S. Army. He's a distinguished graduate of the U.S. Military Academy and a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University. And he's also the author of Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife and Knife Fights, a Memoir of Modern War. So without further ado, let me turn it over to you, John.
Thanks so much, Raleigh, and thanks to FPRI and our mainline briefings sponsors. Great to have everybody together on this historic day, and delighted to have my friend Evan Ellis here with us. Evan is a research professor of Latin American Studies at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. He focuses on the region's relationships with China and other non-Western Hemisphere actors, as well as transnational organized crime in the region. Dr. Ellis has published more than 270 works, which is ridiculous, including 3 books on China and Latin America, and most recently, the 2018 book, Transnational Organized Crime in Latin America and the Caribbean. Dr. Ellis is freshly off a year working in Foggy Bottom, working in the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Staff, SP, for the cognoscenti, with responsibility for Latin America and the Caribbean, WHA, as well as International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, INL. So he was dual-hatted while he spent that year at State, and we're grateful for his service there. Among many other honors, Dr. Ellis has been awarded the Order of Military Merit Jose Maria Cordova. Feel pretty good about my pronunciation there, by the Colombian government for his scholarship on security issues in the region. And I've also done a little bit of work on Colombian security, fascinating subject. And we'll get to talk about that a little bit. But given the day, Evan, can I get you to start off by saying a little bit about how you think American policy toward Latin America is going to change under the Biden-Harris administration?
Well, first of all, John, thank you very much. And thanks to FPRI. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm honored to be able to share my views. I also just need, as a employee of the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, I will be very frank about my opinions, but need to qualify that these are strictly my own opinions. Having said that, I think clearly there are some artifacts of the challenges that the region present that are not going to change overnight from going from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. I think we're certainly going to see some changes in style. I think we're going to see some attempts to innovate or do things in a different way. Overall, given that certain key people, have not been named, so we still do not know who the Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs will be at State. We now do know that at DoD, it looks like my friend Dan Erickson will be OSDP Western Hem. But so as the team comes together, I think what does become clear is that you're going to see people coming in with a lot of experience in using the institutions in which they're charged, and without going into an excess of detail, for example, I mean, the fact that coming in Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was previously the #2 person and is very comfortable with using state as the instrument of diplomacy. The same thing with Jake Sullivan coming in at the NSC, and the same thing working with others. Again, an understanding that there probably will be a relatively good coordination between NSC and state and DoD, as well as even below. For example, the Western Hemisphere Region Director, Juan Gonzalez, who brings in an enormous amount of experience. So I think more than anything else, I think we're going to see the enduring problems will continue to shape the region and shape the policy response, not to be night and day. But I think we're going to see some differences in style and some real use of the institutions that we have to do some interesting things. And I like to believe that we're going to see a different tone, as well as that we're going to probably see a greater amount of work with U.S. allies, not only allies in the region itself, but with allies such as the European Union, Japan, others, with respect to the combined interest that we all have involving this, among other regions.
Thanks, Evan. And now President Biden has said that his #1 priority is COVID. And of course, we're all familiar with the extraordinary loss that the United States has suffered, 400,000 dead from that horrible epidemic. Can you talk about how COVID is affecting Latin America?
Absolutely. And first of all, I think it's going to be clear that COVID will continue to be with Latin America, as with the U.S. for a while, tragically. Indeed, it's interesting when we look at Latin America itself that although Latin America has about 18% of the world's cases, it has had about 27% of the world's deaths from COVID. So, for example, with the horror here of the 400,000 Americans that have died in the U.S., Latin America, that figure is 546,000. So it really has been difficult for the region. What I would say, and at the risk of really accentuating anybody's bad day, what I see over the long term is that it's really going to create challenges of creating a region which is poorer, more fiscally constrained, with higher levels of crime, higher levels of social protest, indirectly advancing different left groups, and probably opening up the way for China to expand in the region. And let me try to explain a little bit of that very quickly. With respect to poverty, many of the areas, the companies that were shuttered, and also some of the hardships in the informal sector, that was not fully covered by the ability of the government to help. So when we look at, for example, the 2,000 person caravan coming up from Honduras, trying to make it into Guatemala, and I think we're going to see more of those types of things, just the conditions that have been unleashed in the region are created a lot of problems. But at the same time, if you think about the COVID spending that we had in the United States, in Latin America, they have not had the ability to borrow or cover that fiscally. And so, for example, just looking at Colombia, Colombia's debt as a part of GDP was about 48% in 2019. By 2020, it had risen to 64%, kind of just giving you a feel of how much more in debt and how much that means that Latin American governments will be constrained in a whole lot of other places. In addition, although right now you haven't seen the uptick in crime because, again, social distancing is in effect, and frankly, people don't like to report, go to sit around a fiscal office or a police station, where they're likely to actually contract the virus. But I think as you see the end of social distancing and easing of the disease, the real higher level of crime that has been produced by this, I think, will start to become more apparent. And with respect to protests, if, for example, in October 2019, when you had very serious protests over government performance in Chile, in Ecuador, in Colombia, if pre-COVID there were expressions, very serious expressions of problems in the region, I think right now all of the factors are there to see something even more, because you have the greater crime, you have the greater need, you have any number of different causes to protest over the government, whether the healthcare system was not sufficient, whether the government opened up too quickly, whether it didn't open quickly enough, whether there was serious acts of corruption in public procurement. So I think even now you're starting to see things like the protests in Chile, the protests in Guatemala, including the burning of the Congress, where even though not directly related to COVID, I think that indirectly behind the scenes, you're going to see a lot more social mobilization. And within that, of course, you have the advance of the left. And in some ways, in places like Venezuela or Nicaragua, the ability to shut down the economy actually helped the left to center to extend their period in power. In other places, you're seeing the way in which the social pressures create new openings for the left. So, for example, in Ecuador, where the relatively unpopular regime of Lenin Moreno is created an opening. So, in this February election, the left of center candidate Andres Arauz could come to power. And frankly, in other places like Peru, where you have multiple candidates, or Chile or Colombia, where it's just the amount of chaos that creates an opening for the left. So I think overall, it's sad to say, but in this region that's deeply connected to the United States in terms of our security and prosperity, COVID has really unleashed a lot of mutually reinforcing problems that concern me a great deal.
I just want to highlight, you mentioned the total deaths north of 500,000 across Latin America from COVID, but that's against a population that's more than twice that of the United States across all of Latin America as a whole. So the death rate for Latin America is significantly lower than that of the United States.
I think if you actually do the math, and it some countries are certainly worse than others. I mean, Brazil, it's been horrendous. Mexico has been horrendous, but it's been out of proportion to the populations, especially in some countries. But absolutely.
And because I know how interested you are in China, is China using these COVID-induced changes as an opportunity for it to gain leverage across the United States, against the United States, or against our interests in the region?
What I'd say is that the COVID has actually accelerated a number of trends that were already underway with respect to China's position in Latin America. I'm not sure I would say that China is doing it explicitly to use COVID against the United States, but I think what you can see is that there will be a significant expansion of China's role. There's going to be somewhat of a delay in that expansion playing out, and it's going to occur actually with a lot of controversy and pushback towards China, which may create both some headaches for the region, but maybe some opportunities for U.S. diplomacy. But just kind of going through some of the issues. On the one hand, you've had a lot of Chinese COVID diplomacy in the region, giving ventilators, personal protective gear, frankly, a lot of which didn't work. There was the famous case in Peru where they bought a series of 1.4 million tests from a Chinese company called Orient Gene Biotech. And in the end, in part because of the nature of the test, they're antibody tests, but in part, frankly, they were largely defective tests. They had a lot of false positives and contributed to a significant takeoff in Peru. Or for example, in Brazil, it just turned out that the Sinovac vaccine that's being developed in Brazil, if you look at like companies like AstraZeneca and others, where you're talking about effective rates in the 90s, this Sinovac, this Chinese vaccine that Brazil really is bet about half of the bank on, is only about 50% effective, and there's some disputes over lack of transparency. So even some of the COVID support has created problems. But beyond that, what you do see is there are a number of different ways in which China is, first of all, getting leverage. So even now in Brazil, with the Speaker of the Lower House, Rodrigo Maia, you see that they're having to start to negotiate with the Chinese over trying to get more vaccine, which again, creates opportunities for the Chinese. You're seeing the importance of Chinese demand, with the Chinese economy projected to grow 8% this year, even while U.S. and Europe is relatively slow. So, for example, in Brazil, I think Brazil's soy exports, even in the worst months of COVID, to China were up 40, 50, 60%. So again, that creates impacts on supply chains and the Brazilian exporters that gives China leverage. You have opportunities for China to participate in bailouts and work projects. And so, again, Ecuador, who had significant loans from China under the Correa regime, actually just signed up for a new $2.4 billion loan for that relatively small country. In Mexico, where you already had the Chinese participating in major projects like Tren Maya and the Dos Bocas refinery, you're now starting to see the prospect where if Western help is not forthcoming in investing in the oil sector or the electricity sector. AMLO might find in Mexico, Andres Manuel López Obrador, the president, that China starts to look like an increasingly needed partner if he wants to produce those jobs and infrastructure for Mexico. Beyond that, frankly, again, the increase of populist governments in the region, now with Argentina consolidating its populist regime there, with Bolivia coming back in, with Venezuela surviving. These regimes historically, especially Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia, have been major contractors to the Chinese. And so as the left comes back, you're going to see an expanded opportunity for China. And then finally, just like we saw in the 2008-2009 timeframe and after, when we had the last lesser financial crisis, what's happening now is that in about a year or two, as things begin to settle out in Latin America, you're going to start to see US and European and other multinationals who are trying to shore up their position by getting out of or selling off assets in non-performing markets like Latin America. And like we saw with the Chinese back then, that will create buying opportunities for the Chinese to expand their physical presence. I mean, you're already seeing it, for example, with the $3 billion acquisition by State Grid of the electricity producer Naturgy in Chile, which increases China's influence in the Chilean electricity generation sector up to almost 50%, just to name a few things. Moda Engil was another important. So again, as all of these things happen, however, again, it's going to happen in the context of a Latin America that's more poor, that's more polarized, that's more socially mobilized, that already is going into this with a certain amount of distrust towards the Chinese. And so I think you're going to see it cut both ways. You're going to have more Chinese influence. That's going to make Washington, give them something to think about. But at the same time, you're going to have the Chinese having to stomp out a lot of fires that their own companies and presence creates.
And I'm delighted to report that we have our first audience question, which fits in very well to this discussion. Carlos Rivers asks, will the United States compete in providing digital or physical infrastructure in Latin America with these Chinese efforts to provide funding and other resources?
That's a great question. And I think oftentimes it's important to understand that the nature of Chinese engagement and nature of the world system we're in right now is very different than it was during the Cold War with the former Soviet Union. And so oftentimes the instinct to say, okay, well, China gives something, we should give aid as well. China does a loan, we should do a loan as well. Sometimes that's either not strategically wisest, or sometimes that's not a viable solution. So for example, specifically with respect to digital, oftentimes there is not a US-based firm in the space. And so for example, if you look at Brazil's 5G, some of the most competitive offerings are, for example, other companies like Nokia, or I believe Ericsson has a strong position in that space. And so on the one hand, the US might find itself in a position where it's really not about, what can the US pony up, but rather saying, how can we work with like-minded allies who also respect intellectual property and things like that, to not necessarily provide a US counter, but at least to move Latin America in a way where the investments and the companies that are operating there are most respectful of rule of law and intellectual property and things like that. And frankly, over the long term, it is, and again, having been on the policy planning staff at State and having worked this, real time, it's just not usually the best idea to try to tell our partners in the region, in an interdependent world, you can't have economic interactions with the Chinese, you can't have political interactions with the Chinese. My personal sense is that oftentimes some of our best policy options have to do with focusing on some of the things that we do best, emphasizing transparency, which makes it more difficult to do essentially corrupt, dirty deals with certain elites in the shadows, emphasizing rule of law and the legal playing field, and frankly, helping to shore up our partners' institutions so that they have the type of upfront planning, the type of contract evaluation capability, and the type of enforcement against, if they award a contract to a Chinese company in, whether it's making sure that they're complying with environmental or labor or other laws. And along the way, that keeps the United States from being seen resentfully and allows the United States to be seen as we're helping our partners get the best from what China and everyone else has to offer, and along the way, showing the democratic institutions work. So, but it is an important question. And what I do believe is that certainly there was a lot of attention, increase in attention with the 2017 NSS to the challenge China poses in Latin America and elsewhere. I think you saw that with Secretary Pompeo and others. And what I know of the incoming Biden team is I think we have every reason to expect that there is going to be a continued understanding of China's interplay in those regions. And frankly, without going into detail, I've worked with some of the people before who actually I can tell you I know understand China and the region very well.
And I appreciate the distinction you drew there between the United States and many of our partners and allies as hopefully exemplars of the rule of law, and China, which doesn't always do that. I want to stay on China but for just another minute, and I continue to encourage questions to come in. But is Taiwan playing any sort of role in Latin America, presumably on the other side of the rule of law, good guys divide?
No, that's a great question. And yes, as a matter of fact, of the relatively small number of states in the world that continue to diplomatically recognize Taiwan, more than half are in Latin America, especially. You have Paraguay in South America, and then of course you have 4 in the Caribbean, specifically Haiti, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and St. Lucia. And then of course in Central America, you have Belize, Honduras, Guatemala, and in Nicaragua. And so, frankly, during COVID and other responses, actually, Taiwan was, from everything that I've seen, a very strong partner. And one of the things that I think the outgoing administration did very effectively, and especially I saw it at state, was to understand the important role that Taiwan as a democratic society can play. And so I think obviously right now the Taiwanese are probably very, very nervous and wondering how things are going to play out, because I think although they did a good job with their partners through COVID, the long-term needs are so great. And what often happens is through the Chinese United Front activities and the associated friendship committees and other things, you constantly have this lobby against business communities who may have connections. And so in Paraguay last year, you had the use of the United Front to bring a vote in the Paraguayan Senate, which was quashed, but it was still notable. Significant pressure also with Haitian elites. And so there are a lot of questions that things seem okay now, but for example, right now a lot of pressure with the Jovenel Moïse government, which actually ends its constitutional mandate in February. Well, who replaces Moïse, and does that create an opening for the Chinese there? Similarly, in some cases, it looks like there's good news stories. So in St. Kitts, you just had a coalition with relatively pro-Taiwan just returned to power, but you have questions in other places. And so again, in Belize, you just had a changeover in government, some questions there. And then frankly, when we look at some of the other things playing out in the region, so frankly, in Honduras, in Guatemala, one of the things that the diplomatic wrangling between Taiwan and China raises is the issue of how is what we do affecting Taiwan's position and vice versa. And so, one can imagine a situation in which, a implication of a, if there's a, pressure on a leader over human rights, whether it's over CICIG or others, the GMT government in Guatemala, or whether it's a indictment from the Independent Justice Department against the president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was publicly named last year in a New York court. Does that then set into a series of motions where those pressures say, okay, the leader says, okay, well, we're gonna recognize the PRC. We're gonna take their money. We're not gonna play nice with Washington anymore. We're going to use Chinese money to pursue a different path. And they don't ask us about corruption, and they don't ask us about human rights. So it's all interdependent. But absolutely, Taiwan in the broader advance of democracy in the region, I think has played a critical role. And I was happy to see that recognition, with in the past administration.
I'm going to continue to learn to use my mute button. And then I'm going to stay with the questions, the very good questions that are coming in. So from Edgar Villanueva. Edgar believes that the Biden team is going to return to the Northern Triangle logic as opposed to the Trump administration focus on bilateral interactions. Do you think that makes sense? Do you think the countries of Central America are in a position to work on a regional basis rather than in a bilateral arrangement?
And it's an interesting question. And I think, first of all, I think we can expect that there will be a increased attention, or at least a high level of knowledge by President Biden to the Northern Triangle states, specifically Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. If you go back to when he was a vice president, he really was the point person for then President Obama in putting together the Alliance for Progress. And although not all of the money that was hoped for that program, the $1 billion came through, you see basically a new and even larger version of that program, understanding the relationship between the prosperity of those countries and in immigration. I think certainly the immigration issue, and as we've already heard, the announcements, the indications are, changes in policies on immigration, which will make it necessary, or at least create motivations for many, as we've already seen with the Honduran caravan, to try to come to the United States. Again, with possible changes in asylum, et cetera. And so, working and putting together effective programs will become more important as ever. Now, I would, and again, having worked this, I would say that there was a certain amount, there was a mixture, as there always is, of unilateral and multilateral. And also the question is, when we talk about multilateral, are we talking specifically about the Northern Triangle, or are we talking about Central America as a whole, and not forgetting, always important, Costa Rica and the vital, commercial and financial hub, which is Panama, with the Cortizo government, which has been a friend. But what I think you see, and again, thinking of the experience in the region, such as, for example, with Juan Gonzalez, who comes in, as NSC region director, and others, and frankly, for example, on DOD, Dan Erickson, who was a key person with then Vice President Biden, working some of these Central American issues. I'm confident that you're going to see an amount of sophistication brought to that, both unilaterally and multilaterally. But I think, one of the big questions is, how big will the need be? And number two is how much money and attention will there be, given all of the fires that we have to put out on the U.S. side right now?
Mm-hmm. And do you, got the mute right this time, do you see the, and I believe now President Biden sent this bill to Congress today, providing a path to citizenship for the 8 or 9 million illegal aliens currently living in the United States. Do you see that increasing or decreasing migratory pressures from Central America, Latin America, toward the United States?
That's a great question. And without, while staying neutral on the proposal itself, my sense is that will tend at multiple different levels to increase pressures, and not just in Central America. So, first of all, it will indicate that, because there is a path to citizenship, because not only now but in the future, and if you go back to what happened with Ronald Reagan, I believe it was 1983, 1984, again, that oftentimes those types of efforts to reconcile current migratory situations and regularize current migrants, which absolutely important and necessary, creates expectations for the future. So I think the combination of changes in asylum and new paths, as well as other possible things like action on DACA and TPS and et cetera, which I understand is indirectly part of this bill. So on the one hand, that is, again, that is going to be a change that sends a message more quickly than, very deeply suffering Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador are going to see things get better. I mean, remittances are down. I mean, Honduras and Nicaragua were just blasted, in addition to COVID, by Hurricane Eta and Iota. And the other dimension of this, frankly, is Mexico. Mexico was a critically important partner for us in also managing migratory flows, and not just allowing people to show up on the northern border and making it the U.S. problem. The cooperation that we got from actually the AMLO regime in helping to control both on the southern border and migratory camps in terms of those who were seeking asylum was a critical element of the integrated approach. And so the issue now becomes that if you have a change on these policies, at the same time you have changes in the U.S. relationship with Mexico, you're going to have a completely different dynamic through Mexico to the U.S. border. So, all the pieces come together, but I think, and I think President Biden and his team understand that in doing this, they are creating a problem that's going to get a whole lot worse before it gets better. But I commend them for doing it.
I think you just commended them for supporting a problem that's going to get worse, which is not generally good policy advice, but we'll let it go. We've done a great job. I understand. We've done a great job, I think, of talking about China. We haven't yet talked about your other area of specialization, transnational crime. And we've got an interesting question from David Rosenberg, who suggests that Iran and other state sponsors of Islamist terror are involved in transnational crime in Latin America. And now pulling both of your two intellectual interests together, does China have a hand in these activities? And if so, why?
Great question. I mean, one of the things that we've seen, especially as legitimate ties between China and Latin America have increased, especially in the past 20 years, with the associated increase in flows, goods moving across the Pacific, the increased, relationships between businessmen, increasing opportunities to move money, and with banking relationships, et cetera. That with all of those increases in, call them legitimate ties, also has expanded the illegitimate. So with respect to drug sourcing, again, some of those business ties spilled over into, for example, the Sinaloa cartel and later the Jalisco Nueva Generación cartel beginning to source precursor chemicals such as ephedrine and pseudoephedrine for methamphetamines from China, ironically from Wuhan. That took a big hit in the early days of the virus, but they figured out a way to work around it. But fentanyl as well is sourced primarily in China. But then at the same time, it's not just about the drugs. So, for example, you have a lot of the illegal mining sector, whether it's in Peru and places like Madre de Dios or elsewhere. A lot of those goods are ultimately purchased by consolidators in the black market, some of whom are Chinese, and ultimately a lot of those goods end up going to China once they have been laundered, so to speak. In addition, you have the issue of trade-based and other money laundering. So, one of the famous cases a couple of years ago was a case that the DEA was able to publicize, where basically Mexican cartels were outsourcing their money to Colombian partners who were operating in different port cities in China, who would basically take bulk cash and they would buy stuff in unnamed, fabric factories as well as, using currency trading houses and other things, import the goods then through the port of Cologne and basically distribute them as, legitimate imports from China. You also have, frankly, human trafficking and other types of activities, in part that comes through Chinese communities. And so it used to be famous that, the same route that was used by Central American migrants going up through Frontera Corozal and in Mexico and working up the Gulf Coast to get to the United States was also being used by basically Chinese. And especially you saw this in terms of other routes in the Caribbean, where again, as the Chinese firms were coming into like China Dailan and Suriname or others, or China Harbor, I believe it was in Guyana, that the importing of Chinese workers would be affiliated with basically the smuggling through Chinese communities of people off the books as well. And so, and one of the things also that's happened, and there are cases that came to light in places like Trinidad and Tobago and in others, is that those communities, which often are relatively closed to awareness of local police forces, oftentimes because it's hard to find police who speak Cantonese or Hakka or other languages, or other dialects, let alone Mandarin. But without that police penetration, without that real awareness of what's going on, these become areas where you can do micro money laundering. These become areas where you can smuggle people through and use them for labor in the shops. They become some import export type of trade-based money laundering activities. So really it's a problem, I think, that is naturally increasing as the as trade and investment between China and Latin America legitimate increase. And the one thing I think it's important to say is there's no evidence that I've seen that that the PRC government is in any way doing this deliberately or somehow what one does see, however, is that there have been certain opportunities that this has presented. For example, in the case taking down the Chinese triad Piasecki in Argentina back in, I think, 2015, where that happening has created an open door for the Chinese to come in and say, hey, we'll send some of our police in to help you out. But then that expands opportunities for the Chinese to get both intel and build relationships that may make us in the U.S. a little bit uncomfortable. So it's a real multifaceted problem, but it's a great question. So I appreciate the question you're asking it.
And you've thank you. And you've covered some of this, but can you talk to the specific drug issue and with a particular focus on Mexico and the recent Trump administration pardon of a Mexican drug kingpin?
Yeah, Salvador Cienfuegos. As a matter of fact, I am very, very worried about where the relationship is going with Mexico right now. I had the privilege of working closely with Mexican security forces before I joined state and continue to interact during my time at state as well. And my personal sense is that there is no partner with which we are more connected in terms of our security, in terms of our prosperity and investments and things like that. And so when you see things start to go south, it becomes a real object of concern. So as the audience is doubtlessly aware, Mexico, with AMLO coming in, is at a horrible point in terms of violence. This started before AMLO came into power with the sexenios of Felipe Calderón and later Enrique Peña Nieto. But there's been a fragmentation that's caused the proliferation of violence. But amidst that fragmentation, you've had certain kind of mega groups. And so, Sinaloa used to be one of them, but what used to be a splinter of Sinaloa, run by a particularly ruthless, head, which is Jalisco Nueva Generación, has little by little been basically doing a civil war for control over plazas and territories, along with other cartels, and that's expanded the violence in a lot of different areas. Now, on top of this, the whole part of the difficulty is that when AMLO came in, he did a reorganization of the Mexican security sector, which couldn't have sadly have been at a worse time. So he eliminated the national police, which wasn't perfect, but he replaced them with a National Guard, which wasn't able to recruit enough police and new people fast enough. And so the military basically had to come in and fill in the guard ranks. He eliminated Mexico's version of the CIA, CISEN, which did have some problems, but the new organization, the CNI, was not able to replace the problems. His own security chief, Alfonso Durazo, resigned not too long ago, actually, to run for another state office in Mexico. And in that, there's also been a growing level of concern of where is AMLO coming from? And so I don't want to impute more, but there were some key items of concern that have occurred, especially in the past 2 years. One, in October 2019, there was a major operation against one of the sons of El Chapo Guzman, one of Sinaloa's key drug kingpins. And the issue was that he was in custody, but because there was a major firefight that was going on around the city of Culiacan, a decision came down from apparently the Presidencia itself to release him. That caused a lot of people to wonder, well, what's going on with AMLO in Sinaloa? But what's happened just in recent days, I think, is deeply and let me go back. First of all, there was a national security law passed, I think, just about 2 weeks ago, which made it took away the DEA's immunity to operate in Mexico. Now, we have long not been operating in any military fashion, but it's customary to have reciprocal agreements, to cooperate on counter drug. But so to take away the DEA immunity and then also put into place a whole series of reporting requirements, which just made it super difficult or will make it super difficult to cooperate. And then on top of that, again, there was a independent U.S. Justice Department, a very well developed case, about 700 pages was the dossier, against the head of the Mexican army, the army. This is General Salvador Cienfuegos, who, whatever his other, and he did a lot of good things. He had an important role, for example, in organizing Mexican military police brigades. So actually, the gentleman did a lot of good things for Mexico. But the Justice Department case raised a lot of concerns, and the fact that that once we agreed to suspend the case and send it back to Mexico, and then Mexico said, we're not going to prosecute him. And then Mexico turned around and publicized the 700-page DOJ cases, sources, methods, details. And so, if you want to basically give away things that are sensitive, things that the Department of Justice is doing and sensitive people the Department of Justice is working to, it was unthinkable what AMLO did. And so we're going down a path right now. So it's not just about where Mexico is going in terms of the statistics, but as President Biden and his team comes in, my hope is that this is just a certain amount of posturing to try to set expectations really low so that whatever happens can only get better from here. But given the importance of Mexico, there are a lot of difficulties on the table about where this relationship is going.
And we've got two questions that look at Cuba. One asking whether the Biden administration is going to be able to push Cuba out of Venezuela, and another asking about whether Venezuela and Cuba are supporting ELN in Colombia and what we can do about that.
Let me take the second question first. Absolutely, the ELN is in Venezuela. As a matter of fact, going back literally a number of years, even in the early days of Hugo Chavez, the previous head of Venezuela, some of the military pressure from the Colombian military pushed the ELN out of some of their older operating areas and basically towards the border. As there was a permissive environment in Venezuela, over the years, you actually saw the ELN beginning to operate increasingly within Venezuela. However, things have really gotten out of control under the current regime of Nicolas Maduro. Because what had begun to happen is, on the one hand, as oil, so there's a push and there's a pull. So the pull for the ELN is as you had serious military pressure from the Colombian state for both the FARC and then after the peace accords, the FARC dissidents, as well as the ELN, especially the ELN, the Eastern Front, Pablito. The using that as a safe area to have weapons, to do recruitment from needy Venezuelans, et cetera, and then increasingly what happened is that, first of all, Maduro needed a buffer zone because he thought if the gringos were going to invade through Colombia, and frankly because some of the other criminal groups that are increasingly in control of the areas of Venezuela outside Caracas, so specifically what they call the prenas, the prison gangs, and the sindicatos, as those groups were kind of unruly and undependable from a Maduro standpoint, there was a decision apparently that was made to basically bring the ELN to basically organize the criminal groups so that there could be, so Maduro would have a reliable armed partner to give him a reliable flow of illegal mining. And so to this day, ELN operations, especially in the east and southeast, the west of Venezuela, have become a major factor both in funding the ELN in general and in funding the ELN in. Now, my sense is that the role of Cuba has largely been advising and as well as providing security forces and intelligence forces that make it very difficult for those within the army and the National Guard, et cetera, in Venezuela who might like a more competent regime than Maduro to come into power. And so in many ways, it's been kind of advice and also helping to keep the regime together, as well as other things such as the Cuban doctors, et cetera. But to go back to your question about the Biden administration, it's an interesting interplay because on the one hand, what we at least know from the public statements that have been made by the administration to date is there is an orientation to at least try to go back to reopen or engage with Cuba, although not going so far as to is to just turn a blind eye on Cuba's very serious suppression of dissidents and human rights abuses and things like that. So that does open up the question of the possibility of working with Cuba to try to do a quid pro quo to get Cuba to help out with respect to what is permitted in Venezuela. Now, on the one hand, it's not clear to me how quickly there's going to be space for the Biden administration to move immediately on Cuba. And frankly, I'm not sure how quickly there's going to be space for it to move in Venezuela. I would not be surprised if there's not some exploratory activity. I mean, even today, as I believe in Secretary of State designated Blinken's public statements before the Senate indicated, called Nicolas Maduro a dictator. There was another statement that makes it clear that the Biden administration will continue to recognize Juan Guaido, the de jure government. So I'm not sure how much movement we're going to see right away, and frankly, the realities aren't going to change. The reality is that the Cubans aren't they didn't get out from Venezuela under Obama when Obama pushed a rapprochement, so it's unlikely that they will now, given their greater dependency. Maduro, if nothing else, he now has eliminated the congressional opposition in the past sham elections, has strengthened his position, and so probably isn't going to be looking immediately for special deals. Again, has a sufficient amount of income coming in through cocaine, through other criminal activities, through basically the extortion of remittances and other things where, even if petroleum revenues go to zero, that, there's not immediate pressure for Maduro to broker an unfavorable deal. And part of the other pressure on Venezuela is that there's kind of an understanding within the leadership of the Bolivarian National Guard, who, have been on the take for a number of years, and others, that this, the amount of things that the U.S. and others have on them criminally. So, you had the case when Arreaza, when a leading Venezuelan, went to Aruba. He was, no sooner was his flight up in the air that an Interpol red notice was put out on him. Similar thing with the nabbing of Delcy Rodriguez's kids, the so to speak narco nephews. And frankly, there have been several publicized Department of Justice indictments against specific Venezuelans, not just the sanctions, but indictments. So the message this sends is, we've got stuff on you. If you lose power, it's not just a matter of losing power, but you may very well end up, for a good amount of time in jail or worse. So I think that combination of things mean that although there'll be an attempts to talk with the Cubans, there'll probably be exploratory things with the Venezuelans, but the things that are stuck are not going to come easily unstuck, I think, anytime soon.
We've got two more good questions about Cuba and Venezuela from Arturo Lopez Levy. How do you see the American embargo against Cuba impacting the next summit of the Americas?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for bringing up the Summit of the Americas, because for those of you in the audience who know the history well, one of the defining moments when then President Obama came in was, his address at the Summit of the Americas in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, in I believe 2009. And for Latin America, it was a moment of hope that this could suddenly be a new type of relationship with a new type of president. And so there's an ironic symmetry that that in just 3 months here, we are going to have the next Summit of the Americas in Washington, D.C. With this new team. And so I think and as a matter of fact, in all fairness, there's an excellent article by one of my senior colleagues, Ambassador Patrick Duddy, on the importance of this. And I thoroughly agree with him on that importance as an opportunity. Now, it's one thing to say there's an opportunity. It's another thing to be able to effectively take advantage of the opportunity beyond eloquent speeches. So I think a lot of work needs to be done, and I'm sure will be done between now and then. Now, specifically, whether with respect to Cuba issues at the Summit of Americas, I guess I would revert back to my previous statement that I think there's a lot of work to be done before we can, before the administration will be in a position to make significant, concessions or trade-offs on Cuba. So it's interesting to raise the prospect that something could possibly be announced. I have no special knowledge with respect to what the administration's policy or offering to Cuba might be. Again, this is purely my speculation, and it certainly would seem like a good opportunity, but I think it will be hard to move forward substantively between now and then. But it's always nice time to have beginnings.
And last question on this particular topic. Dan Martinez asks about the 11th hour sanctions on Venezuelan individuals and entities.
No, absolutely. And I appreciate that. And I'll tell you that, again, in my own experiences when I was at State, although these came out right at the end gate, it's, on a weekly basis, on a daily basis, we were working between State, Treasury, NSC with Mauricio Claver-Coron and others to figure out, who was their cases against, who were the sensitivities against, who were the right people, how could we do more things to bring more pressure. And so I actually see this as consistent with really what was an ongoing, very hard day-to-day effort by this administration to bring, very targeted pressure against individuals who, were either, economically corrupt or politically doing the wrong thing or for other reasons. And so, I think it's consistent with that. I don't have any special information about, I mean, certainly, the Venezuelans were not pleased about that, but that was generally how they responded with the rest of the sanctions. And, do those type of actions also, as well as, for example, designation, as, terrorists, do those then, create opportunities for President Biden and his team then to reverse something that's now been putting on as a bargaining position? Maybe. Was that the reason? Can't say. But I think it was entirely consistent, and I think it really goes to the issue of sanctions actually are, in this day and age, there is an unprecedented ability to use sanctions in a targeted way. It's a heck of a lot of work for the people who are building the cases on it, but to do it in a targeted way. The question becomes, though, when you've got a hammer, everything starts looking like a nail. And so I think one of the tasks for, again, the very experienced new team coming in will be, okay, we probably just don't want to throw sanctions out the window because, this is a really good tool, but are there ways in which we can use it differently that might be to better effect? And I think that's probably the technical issues that they're going to be wrestling with.
Thanks, Evan. We've done a nice job of talking about transnational crime. We've talked about drugs. We haven't talked about oil. And obviously the global oil market's down as a result of COVID. Nonetheless, there are substantial oil producing facilities in Latin America. Can you say a few words about the outlook there?
Absolutely. The Latin American oil map is absolutely fascinating because it brings into play just about every other issue that we have with respect to the region. And so again, you have partners for whom oil has been a very important thing. I mean, what was once considered very, very expensive, but now some of the major plays in the Brazilian subsalt as well as in other parts of Brazil, and how Petrobras brings that forward. But on the other hand, how that creates opportunities for actors such as the Chinese to come in. In the same sort of way, looking at an oil producer such as Pemex, who actually had some very significant progress in privatizing the sector, especially during the previous sexennial, and which now seems to be going in the opposite direction, is really kind of trying to wrestle in declining production in, for example, the Campeche Basin and in other places without bringing in new actors. Obviously, Venezuela is another way in which oil comes to play. Venezuela, which is once with its 300 billion barrels plus of recoverable oil, and PDVSA was once the best managed oil company, arguably in the in the hemisphere. Petrobras under Gabriel notwithstanding, but I digress. But now with Venezuelan oil production having fallen off almost to nothing, I think it's at like pre-1930s levels with all major drilling rigs shut down. That where does that go? Then you have questions as you get into the very important new oil plays, actors that we haven't talked about yet, which is Guyana with the ExxonMobil-led coalition, which includes the Chinese companies CNOOC and Hess and others, and the lesser oil play with Total and Apache and others off the coast of Suriname. Now, why are these important? Well, as we look at how important the Caribbean is to us, you have a government, Irfan Ali's government in Guyana that just made it through a very difficult transition. The last time the PPP was in power, the relationship was not the best with the United States, but the groundwork has been set for a much better relationship with this new PPP government. They're sitting on 9 billion barrels of recoverable oil, basically, which positions them. I think their economy last year, even with COVID, grew 31% in 1 year. So by and far, again, 9 billion barrels of oil for 850,000 people. It's a tiny population. Do the math. Same thing with Suriname. So in the case of Suriname, a government that was long under the control of, frankly, a narco-affiliated strongman convicted of murder, Desi Boutresse, actually had a remarkably peaceful transition to a new government by Chan Santoki and a delicate coalition who is a law and order coalition. But oil, once again, there will play an important role in, can he keep the coalition happy and balanced so that he can, take Suriname in a very different direction than it's been before. Or if you look at a country like Trinidad and Tobago with a relatively left, center of left government, Keith Rowley, for example, will oil in there become what it has been in Venezuela? Will it become a curse fomenting corruption, or can it continue to help Trinidad and Tobago to play an important leadership role in the Caribbean? So in many ways, the role that oil plays across the region is different in every country, but in many ways it limits or supercharges just about every other relationship that is out there. And of course, the U.S. is also an oil exporter, and so the whole question of where the incoming administration's environmental policies, how that intersects with the question of oil. But I'll leave that for subsequent questions.
Thanks, Evan. And Raleigh is about to come back on and chase us off. It's been a fascinating conversation, but it does strike me that we haven't talked at all, I don't believe, about the biggest country in South America, Brazil. And can I get you to just say a few words about the prospects for American relations with that incredibly important country?
Absolutely. And if you go back to World War II, when Brazil actually made a significant contribution to the Allied effort in the Italian campaign, if you look at Brazil's shared interest with the United States in transatlantic security, if you look at basically Brazil's entire history, its diversity, I think it's interesting because although relationships were difficult with the previous leftist center PT governments of Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff, that we had a remarkable coincidence given the personal friendship and respect between Jair Bolsonaro and Donald Trump, that not only I think was there a flourishing of security cooperation and other types of cooperation and getting past some of the areas where economically we competed, but even in areas of social policy, there were new avenues for dialogues that we'd never had before. Now, clearly, there will be a different style of relationship just because of the style of the presidents involved, with respect to President Biden. But again, I think the underlying interests that continue to bind our two countries aren't going away. And I think both President Bolsonaro and I think President Biden and his team clearly understand that. Now, Brazil does face some very serious challenges. Number one is that we oftentimes focus on transnational organized crime going north to south. We talked about the Sinaloa and Jalisco and Brazil has basically what are street gangs, which have become major transnational organizations, such as the PCC, the First Capital Command, which operates throughout South America with its tentacles. Brazil has significant problems with respect to other areas. Well, Brazil is going through a very difficult political period where President Bolsonaro is facing some political crises, not unlike what we saw here in the United States, including some pushback against police violence in places like Rio Negro. But you have a very important you have a very fractionalized Brazilian Congress, and so Brazil's ability to wrestle with some of its problems will be a challenge. And frankly, one of the things that will be a major decision with respect to the heart of Brazil will be its relationship with China. Half or almost half of China's FDI in the past 15 years into the Americas has actually gone directly into Brazil. And it's not just about the things we often talk about. Yes, they are in the oil sector. Yes, they're in the iron sector. Yes, they are a purchaser of 46% of Brazil's agricultural exports, but they are also in fintech. They have a successful rideshare application, Didi. Alibaba, Tencent, those companies are there. They have a major presence, a matter of fact, the first major presence in the electricity transmission and generation sector, over $20 billion between SPIC, State Grid, and China Three Gorges. A major presence in 4 Brazilian ports, including a possible new expansion in a mega port in São Luís. So really one of the questions for Brazil in part is the relationship with the United States and its other problems, but also wrestling with where is the soul of Brazil with respect to taking advantage of the opportunities, but not getting essentially co-opted by the expanding influence of China.
Woo! We've done, I think in an hour, we've done a remarkable job of covering some of the challenges, the perils, but also the prospects for growth in American relationships with the countries of Latin America. Dr. Ellis, your command has been exemplary and impressive. And on behalf of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, I am enormously grateful. Allow me to express my thanks, those of Raleigh and the entire organization. And let me thank all of you who participated in this discussion on what has been a busy news day anyway, but really, really pleased to have this chance to spend some time with Dr. Ellis and with each of you. So thanks so much, everybody. We will see you next month when I believe I am going to be answering the questions as we look at the 30th anniversary of Operation Desert Storm. And maybe we can get Dr. Ellis to tune in for that one as well. It's a little outside your area of specialization, but a little broadening never hurts anybody. So thanks to everybody for being here. Dr. Ellis, any final words?
It's been an honor to be part of this, and my very best to FPRI, and my thanks to the audience. Those who have an interest in being on the distro list that I use for my occasional publications, I am pleased to work with through FPRI. Anybody who would like to reach out, I'd be more than happy to do so. And again, on this first day of the new administration, working towards unity, that we may not see things always eye to eye, but we are all Americans working on a common project which we believe in. So into this bold new future, and thanks everyone for being part, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you here in the show.
Well said, Dr. Ellis. A good reminder that the Foreign Policy Research Institute is nonpartisan, but is dedicated to keeping America strong and safe. And I think we've made some progress on that today. So thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.